Started then.
Good to go.
All right. Well, hello. I'm Mike Barnett. I serve as Academic Director of the Rutgers Institute for Corporate Social Innovation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first seminar in our QUASI seminar series. These seminars are designed as debates on important topics related to social innovation. As you can see, I'm kind of reading out of that right corner here. Our aim isn't to convince you that a certain perspective or answer is correct. We're not here to crown winners in these debates. Instead, we want to help enrich and refine the research questions that scholars use when studying these topics. As editors, reviewers, readers, writers, and teachers of the material underlying these debates. Can you mute everybody too, Deborah? Thanks. We all know all too well that too much of the literature focuses on uninteresting questions that only rehash and reword prior studies. It's our hope that by pointing out what's known on all sides of a debate in very pointed and direct and engaging ways, that we can drive researchers to produce sharper advances in our understanding of how to help business to better serve society. So today we debate the question, can shareholder-owned corporations maximize profits without harming their stakeholders? Answering in the affirmative is Bentley's and Business and Society's Jill Brown. In the negative is Michigan's, by way of Stanford's man of no opinion, Jerry Davis, arguing that it depends from the Great White North. We have York's very own Rob Phillips, beard and all. And our moderator is Boston College's intellectual shaman, Sandra Waddock. What an awesome group. Each intern for up to 15 minutes will argue their positions. As they do so, please stay muted and post any questions or comments in the chat box. When we get to Sandra, she'll synthesize and extend the arguments, and she may even field questions in her time. But primarily, the open discussion that Sandra will moderate will occur after all four of our presenters have spoken in the half hour or so that remains thereafter. So let's get the party started. Jill.
Okie dokie. I am going to share my screen. And I think everybody can see. Yes? We're good? Okay. Off to the races. I just want to note that we were assigned our positions. So that's my disclaimer right from the beginning. Okay? So here we go. Here we go, though. Can shareholder-owned corporations maximize profits without harming their stakeholders? Heck yes, they can. What's the big debate here? Claim one that I argue is that this question leads one to think of maximizing profits with a shareholder primacy orientation. And I explain how businesses and their boards have evolved beyond this, particularly when looking at maximizing profits more broadly to maximizing firm value. This is very much an instrumental perspective. My second claim is the idea that, with a few notable exceptions, businesses are conditioned to avoid harming stakeholders. And I outline the business level constructs that support this. This is both instrumental and normative in perspective. My third support claim is that, kind of combining these two ideas, I argue that maximizing profit / value is not at odds with stakeholders' interests. In fact, firms with the best stakeholder relations offer higher overall value. Therefore, as I'll show, firms are motivated both implicitly and explicitly to treat their stakeholders well under the almost unattainable goal of maximizing profits. And that is a shout out to Peter Drucker, who would probably be a little upset with what I'm arguing, but that's okay. His big term, almost unattainable goals. Here we go. Claim one. The argument. Shareholders do not own the corporation, and I believe companies do understand that today. From legal, economic perspectives, from the firm when you view it as a nexus of contracts, looking at the firm as a team-based corporate production model, these of course are Stout's arguments, and there's evidence that this is in the rearview mirror as we look at it in practice. Let's look at, in 2019, the statement for the Business Roundtable that redefined the purpose of the corporation and identified their mission to promote more of a stakeholder orientation amongst all these 180 plus CEOs of publicly traded corporations. There's also been a similar evolution if we take a look at asset management. For example, that arena where ESG criteria has been growing and value creation now depends on partnerships. As another example of that, the Indian conglomerate Reliance Industries announced right before the BRT a very similar sentiment, that they would be approaching their business from more of a stakeholder orientation. Heck, even Michael Jensen has stepped back from a shareholder primacy kind of viewpoint, and you can see that, plug for Darden, in the Fishing with Dynamite video that they have released. where Jensen actually steps back a bit from his shareholder primacy orientation. Even Adam Smith believed in more of a stakeholder fairness of exchange, even in the maximization of profits. And for that, you can look at my article with Bill Forrester in Journal of Business Ethics. And by the way, we were encouraged to self-cite, so I'm just going to put that out there too. Now, of course, the caveat is that even with this kind of new sentiment, business reactions to the pandemic that we're currently in kind of provides a litmus test about whether businesses are walking the talk. And I put a link to my blog about that. But regardless, the talk provides evidence of a newer orientation, one that is not about shareholder primacy, even when maximizing profits is the overall goal. Number two, firms are conditioned to avoid harming stakeholders. Of course, this kind of gets wrapped into a risk management standpoint, that there's risk management benefits to a multi-stakeholder orientation that has been well received in the marketplace and create value for shareholders in a win-win. And of course, there I'm kind of referencing Godfrey's work Godfrey Marilyn Hanson's work along those lines. But even our host, Mike Barnett, has written quite a bit about this. I provide reference to a special issue guest editorial by Mike and Andy Hoffman on legitimacy that speaks to the interdependence and ruling effects of a firm's reputation across stakeholders. I quote, firm's reputation functions as a tool that enables observers to more accurately predict the behaviors of a firm, whether the firm is likely to treat its customers with respect, yada, yada, yada. And with this conditioning, firms work hard to avoid harming broad stakeholders beyond the shareholder. Number two. I'm still on number two. Number one. Here we go. Legitimacy. Legitimacy, such a mucky construct. But I focus in on legitimacy as a perceptual construct linked to social judgments. Businesses understand that they will suffer the social judgments of broader stakeholders, not just shareholders, when they screw up and harm their stakeholders. Evidence of this is the backlash against BP after the oil spill and CEO Tony Hayward's thoughtless comments, where he complained that he wanted his life back, and the $105 billion lost shareholder value that took place. But it took over 7 years for the company to recover, and more broadly, community, employee, and government stakeholders led the charge against BP after the oil spill. Finally, almost finally, if firms do screw up, as in cases like the BP oil spill, firms recognize that they need to utilize a heck of a lot of goodwill to re-engage and recapture stakeholder support, particularly if the level of moral salience attributed to the screw up is very high, i.e. relational with a high level of moral intensity. Shout out to the BEQ article on moral salience that I cite there. Finally, even the shareholders of publicly traded companies recognize that they need to avoid harming stakeholders. Take the institutional shareholders, arguably the most profit max oriented, who have embraced what is called stakeholder activism, the convergence of shareholder and social activism. Shareholder resolutions about social issues have skyrocketed, and now they actually pass about diversity, climate change. Note the Rabine et al. Reference I've provided, and updated info. For example, in 2019, prominent pension funds, asset managers, and other charitable organizations sent a joint letter to all the Fortune 500 companies calling for greater disclosure of mid-level worker pay practices. How about the ICCR, on behalf of over 100 investors, spearheading the submission of more than 10 shareholder proposals focusing on environmental and labor issues? Hence, there's evidence to support this argument. Finally, number three, I'm doing okay time-wise, firms with the best stakeholder relations offer the higher overall value. Even hardcore strategists concede that firms must consider a stakeholder perspective to capture higher rents, i.e. Jay Barney and his RBV view, which talks about the fact that firm financial performance and firms must consider the claims on profits that stakeholder resources help to generate, and therefore a stakeholder perspective is important to managing their firms. As also pointed out by Bossi, Phillips, and Harrison, fairness, reciprocity, cornerstones of stakeholder relations can work hand in hand with entities seeking to maximize their utility. The rent created by a firm is directly associated with perceptions of fairness among its stakeholders. That's also associated with the levels of efforts and resources that stakeholders provide. In sum, a firm can create value by sharing it with stakeholders. There's a little bit of a parallel here to the business case for CSR, so a little shout out there. That economic profitability measures the effectiveness of business activities, ensures the supply of capital. There's a responsibility, profitability connection, and therefore treating stakeholders with fairness and reciprocity will improve the bottom line. Managing for stakeholders creates higher overall value. Hence, the big takeaway here, firms are motivated, again, both implicitly and explicitly to treat their stakeholders well under that almost unattainable goal of maximizing profit. We've got a nice little quote from the former CEO of Unilever that speaks to that. Of course, we always hold up Unilever as an example of a company that's done well, both from a firm financial performance and social performance perspective. And it doesn't have to be a trade-off. Come on. Shareholder-owned corporations can maximize profits without harming stakeholders. Booyah, drop the mic. Yeah.
Sandra, I don't know if you want to do anything in between or not, or we just kind of pop straight over to Jerry, but either way is fine.
Well, I could synthesize now, but maybe we should see what all three perspectives are.
Okay, Jerry? You're still muted, Jerry.
Sorry about that. Something went crazy with my I think. So I'm unmuted now, I hope. All right. All right. So I am here to argue to forget the damned shareholders. I guess this is the punchline of what I want to say today. And I think we want to start with what is the problem that we are trying to solve when we debate the sort of shareholder versus stakeholder thing. And I'm going to argue that we don't really want to look at specific corporations. We want to look at the system of what I would call shareholder capitalism as the pathology here, that's the problem that we really want to address. It's a system problem and not an individual firm problem. And I'm going to claim something that might seem slightly controversial, which is that profit-oriented corporations are responsible for creating or exacerbating nearly every major societal pathology in the West today. So think about what's gone wrong in the United States. If you had to list all of the things that make you unhappy about the United States today, the opioid epidemic was 100% caused by profit-oriented corporations. It was started by Purdue Pharmaceutical with the OxyContin, and it has many followers that are doing much the same thing. Big sugar and the obesity epidemic. In the US today, 40% of Americans are obese, 60% are overweight, and much of this can be attributed to the activities of nutrition companies, snack food companies. I will call them big sugar broadly. We had cracked nicotine addiction. Children had stopped smoking 10 years ago. Then came Juul. And now we have a return of nicotine addiction among young people. That didn't have to happen, but it did because of Juul. And then we've got big tech and the collapse of happiness, truth, and democracy. The big tech firms are largely responsible for many of the social pathologies that we see today. One thing I'd love you to do is to look at all of these companies and ask, what is their mission? Undoubtedly, Purdue Pharma would say our mission is to alleviate human suffering. The sugar companies would say, our mission is to feed the world. Juul claimed that their mission was to enable adults to quit cigarette smoking, and big tech wants to bring the world together. I'd also say that big oil is contributing to the collapse of human civilization because of the climate crisis that we're increasingly facing in the world today. And in fact, I want to make a fairly extreme, if you could wait. I want to make a fairly extreme claim here, which is that economists talk about externalities being an issue, but to the extent that economic activities produce atmospheric carbon that is not priced, if that is the externality, then it seems to me that species extinction is an unfortunate but inevitable externality of shareholder capitalism. As long as economic activity produces carbon that isn't priced, there will be no reason to restrain it. And so we're kind of headed down into a fairly dark place. This is a picture of, I'm living in the Bay Area currently. This is what it looked like a week ago Wednesday because of wildfires in the West. It literally, this is not a retouched photo. This is what the atmosphere looked like in the San Francisco Bay Area a week ago Wednesday, kind of like an episode of Blade Runner or something. So that's the first claim. Profit-oriented corporations are creating the crisis that we're living through in the West today. And I'm giving you some of the particulars of that. The second thing that I want to point out is that listed corporations inevitably put shareholders first because of the many, many mechanisms of corporate governance. Jill was very optimistic about the possibility of companies serving shareholders or other stakeholders, but when push comes to shove, they inevitably put shareholder value first. I want to specify here, it's not that corporations love shareholders more than their other stakeholders. That's not what's really going on. Creating shareholder value in practice means increasing share price. It's not that they love shareholders more than other God's children. It's that share price has become the North Star that guides corporate activities. That is the inescapable fact, I think, for listed corporations. And in the US, we've evolved a vast matrix of institutions that force corporations to focus monomaniacally on share price. Whatever else they might want to do, they will always focus on share price. They've got herds of analysts that reprimand them if they're not keeping their share price high. They have hedge funds that attack them if they don't have an adequate valuation. State corporate law is interpreted by many as forcing them to focus on share price maximization. Boards of directors are often misguided in their belief that that corporate purpose is to maximize shareholder value. I'd say one of the biggest culprits is that executives are overwhelmingly paid based on share price. When that is in place, executive decisions are inevitably going to privilege shareholder value. And then, of course, there's a market for corporate control. If companies come to be perceived as undervalued, there's a set of forces that will come into play to seize control over those in charge. Jill was optimistic about this. I am much less optimistic about this. I'm going to say that investors essentially hate companies that create jobs, that pay well, and that engage in corporate social responsibility. Marc Desjardins and friends have a recent paper in AMJ showing that companies that engage in CSR are more likely to be attacked by activist hedge funds. Companies that behave themselves become targets for activist shareholders. How does all of this happen? If you list on an American stock market, you end up in a vortex. Shoshana Zuboff describes this in the case of the tech economy. You can imagine two grad students creating a really clever way, a really clever search engine that allows you to find the websites that you really want to connect to most. They list on the stock market, they say, don't be evil in their IPO prospectus, and their goal is really to make the world a better place. But once they're listed on a stock market, these forces inevitably point them towards shareholder value. You can see cases where, so Jill mentioned that shareholder proposals are getting increasing support out there to make companies behave. But I have to point out that shareholder proposals are inevitably precatory, which is a legal term for only binding or only ornamental. Shareholders can't force companies to behave themselves, even if they do pass shareholder proposals. It's really up to the board, which inevitably focuses on share price. A couple of instances of this. Mark Zuckerberg controls 60% of the voting rights at the Facebook Corporation. He can select the board, he can buy and sell assets. The guy has complete control over these things. He shouldn't have to care what the share price is, and yet he still does. B corporations, they might be an optimistic alternative, yet we saw what happened to Etsy. They listed as a certified B corporation. Within 2 years, they had a new CEO and they'd abandoned their certified B corporation status. If you list on a stock market, you will turn into a share price oriented corporation, and there's almost no escape from that. The last point I want to make reasonably quickly is that corporations are mostly doomed anyway. So why don't we take the raw materials we've got and start over with better vehicles? As you may know, if you've ever read anything by me in the last 10 years, the number of listed corporations in the US has dropped by half since 1997. There are far fewer public corporations than there used to be, and increasingly, public corporations consist of 5 tech companies and everyone else. As of now, 5 tech firms account for about 23% of the value of the S&P 500. So really, when we talk about public corporations, we're largely talking about a handful of tech firms that seem to be accountable to no one. I'm going to say that the IPO market is not coming back. If you add up all the IPOs in the last 5 years, it's still fewer than there were in 1996 alone. So we're really not seeing replacement with listed corporations. I have a sentence here that is actually a book packed into one sentence. Why is all of this happening? Why are public corporations disappearing? Because ICT-driven reductions in transaction costs for the markets that corporations draw on, finance, labor, supply, and product markets, as well as algorithmic tools for internal management, enable pop-up enterprises that are cheaper and better than traditional institutional corporations. I will send you a book if you're interested in the argument behind that, but that's the broad claim, is that public corporations are increasingly an anachronistic way to organize the economy. So the optimistic thing would be, shareholder corporations are irredeemably wicked. There's not much we can do to reform them. We can try and tack on a purpose, but I really don't, or make them B corporations. I don't think those things are going to work. Given the raw materials that we have now to create something better, more democratic, more humane, why not just start over with a different form, abandon the traditional corporation, and move on to something that's a bit more humane? Thanks, that's it.
Just a modest proposal. Thank you very much. Okay, so Rob, you ready to roll?
Ready to roll. So first of all, thanks, Mike, and the entire RIXI staff for organizing this. I'm honored to be part of this, and it's been very smooth. So thank you all for that. So first of all, let's just get this out there. Shareholders do not own the corporation in any meaningful sense. This is one of those shortcut terms used to help get through a conversation, but it turns out that the shortcut, we've forgotten that it was a shortcut for something else, that it is in fact a proxy for other very complex financial relationships. So if we take a step back and ask, what does it mean to own something? You have the right to use it, you get to say who else gets to use it. So what do shareholders own? By the way, you're also responsible for how it is used if you let someone else use it. So we'll return to that in a moment, but what do shareholders actually own? So under the assumption that some of you in the audience own shares, perhaps you own shares in one of these mega companies that Jerry is talking about, like Apple. It strikes me that if you own Apple, maybe you get free iPods or watches or something like this. That's what I would think it would mean to own something. But alas, I don't think that's what it means in this instance, nor do you even own a proportional part of the corporation. You don't even get part of a watch just by virtue of owning Apple shares, right? You own the rights to a set of cash flows. You get what is left over after everyone else has gotten theirs. And this is actually done. So let me take a step back. What about accountability? I mean, look, if nobody owns the corporation, then to whom are they accountable? And that's always struck me as an odd question, not least because I assume that many of you work for universities, for example. Who owns your university? And so does the fact that there is no ownership at your university mean that none of you are accountable to anyone for anything? Same sorts of things go for those of you out there who may be church members. Help me understand who owns the Catholic Church. And absent ownership, yet somehow it still continues to function and be, at least to Jerry's point, as accountable as publicly traded equity shareholder invested firms, right? Now, you might ask yourself, so what? It's always just been a shorthand way to talk about this, this set of financial relationships. But there is at least, what happens is that you begin to address your problems that actually do not exist. And so Jerry mentioned B Corps. That's a little bit different. And if you want to know why, it's different from a benefit corporation, which is in fact in many states a legal instantiation of your corporation. Now, this was originally intended, I suppose, to get to something like a stakeholder or CSR legitimated organization. The problem is that it's a solution to a non-problem, and by setting up benefit corporations, these legislatures have tacitly acknowledged somehow that there is this other category of shareholder wealth maximizing firms. So it's actually done damage in that instance, and I do believe that there are other sort of business case type arguments that are deployed against what I call a dragon, right? So I've used this metaphor before. Let's imagine that you're walking down the road and you see a dragon occupying all this space in the road. And so you come up with any number of different mechanisms to overcome this dragon so that we can get around the dragon and continue on with what we were doing. Until we remember that dragons are in fact mythical creatures. They don't actually exist. And so we can just continue on down the road as we were and needn't really worry about that so much, right? So that's my first point. Second point, and again, this is not a Citizens United point, but corporations are at least artificial. We together created corporations, and one of the implications of this is that people are complicated, right? So among the complications, for example, undoubtedly self-interested. So allow me a quick riff on self-interest, right? Because of course in business, we're all supposed to be pursuing our rational, narrow self-interest. Just as a quick aside, as a statement of psychological fact, it is either tautological or wrong. Right. So in the one sense, well, you say that everyone is narrowly self-interested, and yet we see activities that look to be other regarding. How do we explain this? And the answer is typically something like, well, your deep utility function really was to help other people. The reason that you rushed into that burning building to save strangers is because really you just wanted a good seat in heaven or something like this. And it was way down deep, just self-interested. The problem with that is that it essentially rules out the other category. If you're going to completely, if a self-interest is just an interest that a self has, then there's literally no room for other regarding interest. You have just ruled it out by definition. But beyond that, we also have evidence from human behavior. I would say that reciprocity is one of the strongest universally across time, cultures, and history, universally held norms that we have. And so our self-interest is basically our notions of fairness. And these are the sorts of things that we could easily take into account. So, and this is not all sort of rainbows and unicorns either, right? So anyone in here who has ever left a tip understands the irrationality of it, right? You've already gotten your service. There's no reason to leave a tip. And now apparently with the plague on, we are picking our stuff up and tipping before we have any idea about the service or the quality of the food. And yet we still do it. But there's also a darker side here, right? Reciprocity also is about revenge sometimes. I will not ask for a show of hands, but I suspect that many of you may have revenge fantasies of things you would do for the just desserts and comeuppance of people that you think have done the world wrong. Fair enough, but again, irrational. Anytime you've sort of cheered for the good guy in the film, or acted even on one of these revenge behaviors, this is in fact irrational. You are hurting other people at cost to yourself, and yet people do this fairly routinely, alas. People are also psychologically complex, right? And so there are myriad examples of this, but I do want to point to my Joshua Green's book, Moral Tribes. One of the best things I've read in ethics in the last 10 years. And it goes into a great deal of conversation about the relationship between emotions, intuitions, and rationality, and these sorts of things. And one of the most interesting findings that he describes from his work in trolleyology, he calls it. So he did some of the original MRI, functional MRI scans around the trolley problem. And one of his findings is that there is a difference between moral dilemmas that are me versus you and dilemmas that are us versus them. And our intuitions, because there's a sort of loose reference to something like Darwinism, but over time we have evolved such that we're good at intuiting me versus you conversation, me versus you dilemmas. We are less good at us versus them dilemmas, because we are more or less tribal. And so we stand by us a lot more. One of the other interesting implications of this has to do with using our rationality and our calculative rationality in particular. He suggests that once we start doing the calculations involved in something like utilitarianism, that we actually come up with intuitively less appealing reactions because of the in-group bias involved in an us versus them dilemma. Again, I could go on like that for a while, but I recommend that book highly to anyone who is interested in seeing how we can add additional complexity to people's decision-making, particularly around business ethics. What does all this mean? Of course, people are complex. Everybody's unique and different. And in fact, we're not even the same people in the morning that we are in the evenings. So even the identity of the human is inconsistent across time. I think we need two things in response to this. The first thing is we need systems that better recognize these human foibles and failings. So I will refer here to James Madison, in Federalist number 10, where he talks about faction. And aren't all people just going to act in their own self-interest? The argument is, yes, let's just take that as given that people are going to act at least somewhat boundedly, perhaps self-interestedly. What sort of system can we put in place that will address that or account for that or mitigate some of the worst effects of that? And so the idea was that the factions, if we set it up rightly with the tripartite government and everything, that they should have checks and balances against one another. But with that in mind, ultimately, organizations just are an artifice. These just are people. And unless there is no system that can overcome or compensate entirely for bad intentioned people, right? It just doesn't exist. And so we have to be better as individuals, as people, which brings me to my third point. It is my considered judgment that there is no more powerful source of human coordination in history than what we currently call ethics, values, norms, morals, all of these different things that we do to hold ourselves together. Certainly something like physical force has a coordination quality to it, but I don't suppose that we are at that point quite yet. So the problem, of course, is that there's two problems. Number one, we often think about ethics and norms as a set of thou shalt nots, getting in the way of what we want to do as business executives, as leaders of organizations. But thou shalt nots don't really, it's easy to agree on them, but it's much more difficult to aspire, to have a vision around what not to do. Don't steal doesn't tell me how to align our values. And to me, this is the essence of stakeholder management, is to the extent that our values are aligned, we don't need quite as many of the other bureaucratic coordination mechanisms. If we know what we stand for around here, then that makes, and we have to argue about that, importantly. We have to argue about these values, and we have to say the extent to which this value applies to this context. And so Johnson & Johnson used to have these credo challenges where they would say, do we still stand for what we've always said we stand for? And so this allows us to better figure out our values, make them more explicit. Because one of the main challenges is that, notwithstanding this force of human coordination, most of our theories, or at least many of our theories, I will say, certainly many of the most influential ones, systematically and intentionally ignore the role of ethics, values, and norms as a coordination mechanism. And this has always struck me as fighting with at least one hand tied behind your back. We're trying to figure out how to manage human beings without acknowledging this giant part of human society. And so I will leave with the idea that there are three things that we're always told, at least in the American South, that you are not supposed to talk about in polite company. And these are sex, religion, and politics. It's always struck me that these are three of the most important things that we do. And the idea of not talking about it, of reinventing the wheel with every subsequent generation on these things, has always struck me as a loss. We have wisdom, we have judgment, we have theories and principles about how to talk about and think about these things. And that's what I think it depends on. The idea of of corporations maximizing shareholder wealth without harming stakeholders depends a lot on how we use these tools and which tools we bring to bear on these questions. That is all for me for now.
Thank you very much, Rob. And Zoom fatigue is a very real thing. It's very hard to pay attention to the speaker and the slides and the chat and everything else going on at the same time. I don't envy Sandra's role, which is just a minor one, of bringing this all together so that we're not talking past each other, and then helping us to develop some more refined questions before we then go into the Q&A. So I don't know if there are a lot of interesting exchanges going on as well in the chat. So turn it over to you and see what sort of magic you can work at this point.
Yeah, I'm a little overwhelmed. I mean, we've heard three really interesting points of view, and I have to say that I agree with all of them in some ways. So, and I'm going to come back to my own thoughts at the end of a few comments. But let me just talk about what I heard. So Jill talked about three perspectives: an instrumental maximizing profits perspective, an instrumental and normative, business is conditioned, she said, to avoid harming stakeholders, and that business is in fact congruent with stakeholder interests. She, like others, made the point that actually shareholders don't own the corporation in any real way. Ownership is, as both Rob and Jerry pointed out, it's a very distinct category of behavior, and owning shares in a company is not the same thing. At the same time, Jill argued that firms need to sustain their legitimacy, and that the reputation is really vital to thinking about how they interact with their stakeholders. And as we all know, it's very hard to build up a good reputation, and it takes only a few minutes to destroy it. Last night I was watching, I think it was CNN, and there was a discussion about the CDC in the United States, which has apparently been corrupted now, and so it's issuing guidance that isn't really scientifically supported. And the argument was that, look, the CDC has spent years and years and years building its reputation, and and it only took, what, a couple of years, or even actually this last couple of months, to completely destroy the reputation of the CDC. That's the same kind of thing happens with companies. So legitimacy does matter to companies. The third claim she made was that companies have to consider stakeholders in order to capture higher rent. It's sort of the instrumental perspective because of notions of reciprocity and trust. And that I think it's not just parallel to the case for CSR, it is the same case as CSR, in fact. So, Jill's arguments basically were that companies are both implicitly and explicitly motivated to treat stakeholders well. Jerry, on the other hand, argued that we should just forget the damn shareholders. And I love that. Thank you, Jerry. And really talk about the fact that it's we've created a system that creates shareholder pathology. It's not an individual firm problem, and I fully agree with this. It's a systems problem, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And he argued that corporations have created most of the problems that we're facing in the world today. It isn't corporations; it's the neoliberal thought process that goes behind corporations. I think, and in particular, that's gotten pretty extreme over the last 40 years, and in the last 70 years too. So it's that process of thinking that the only purpose of the firm is to maximize shareholder wealth is part of the problem. And Jerry points us really well to that. And he also notes that even though companies can claim to have all these higher purposes and all these great things that they're doing, in practice, shareholder value means maximizing shareholder wealth, which orients companies to the short term by definition, creating them as pathological beings, and Rob's comments also point us in this direction, by the nature of what they are being asked to do. So they are doing, I would argue that corporations do exactly what the system asks them to do. And Jerry is pointing us in that direction. He also argued that investors actually hate companies that behave well, that create good jobs or pay well or engage in CSR, because they might in fact be losing a little bit of money in that process. Whoa, okay, that's a problem. And that they're inherently wicked. As Bacon said in his book, The Corporation, some years ago, they're pathological by design. And so if we want to change that behaviors, we have to change the design of corporations at some fundamental level. Rob also noted that shareholders don't own companies. They own the rights to a certain set of cash flows, and part of the problem that generates is that there's very little accountability. And yet, we all are involved in institutions, as Rob points out, where there is accountability despite the lack of ownership. So there are other ways of becoming accountable. And if I could just get one huge takeaway from Rob's point, it's that the system of values and ethics and norms that are created by human beings to monitor and guide and organize our behavior and our attitudes and our practices are the important factor in producing corporate behavior or producing individual behaviors. And Rob points out to us very cogently that corporations are made of people. It's people all the way down, as he said. Corporations, as I think all panelists would agree, are artifacts of a system. So as I told Mike when he asked me if I would do this, I said, well, yeah, I'm not sure it's the right question. So I'll go to a couple of comments of my own, and then hopefully people, there's two ways to get questions. One is to put them in the chat, and the other is to raise your hand in the chat function. And I'm sure by now you all know how to do this since you're probably all teaching on Zoom. It's the wrong question, of course, from a moral perspective. Stakeholders and nature, which didn't get mentioned very much here, need to be taken into consideration. And yet, if we look at the neoliberal paradigm that sort of guides most of the business thinking today, there's no such thing as society, Margaret Thatcher told us. There's no regard for nature, because everything that goes out of corporations that is a negative byproduct is simply called an externality, and it goes out there into society where people pay the cost, or into nature, where we all pay the cost because the ecological systems are failing, as Jerry was pointing us to. So I guess I'd argue, should any company try to maximize profits? Or maybe is there another kind of purpose, a set of purposes we might want to point them to? And I'm a big fan of Tom Donaldson and Jim Walsh's paper on called Toward a Theory of Business, in which they argue for creating collective value absent dignity violations. And I would extend their absence of dignity violations to violating the dignity of nature as well. So if maximization of profits isn't the right value, or isn't the right, it is value, isn't the right purpose, then we need to begin to rethink what the purpose of corporations are, so that it's broader and more holistic, and it brings us into alignment, as I think all of the panelists are trying to get us at, with the needs and demands of our current 21st century crises, and there are many of those crises. So with that said, I will see if I can pick up some questions from the
Sandra, could I ask that maybe, because I don't want everybody to talk past each other, everybody just offer, divergent views, which helps to enrich everybody's perspective.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, let's.
So
Yeah.
I wonder if maybe each of the presenters could offer at least one revised research question, one very specific research question that they think needs still to be narrowly researched, make it as specific as possible, and then we can go to a more open discussion, moderated however you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, I'd argue for thinking about reframing our questions too. So, Bill, you want to start? We'll put you on the spot since you've had all this time to think.
So,
if you could
so
maybe
how about this?
put it in the chat as well, if you have very specific wording, that way maybe we get it recorded. I'd like to be as tangible as possible.
Sure, tangible, gotcha. Okay, so how about this? You recall that when I was arguing my points, I substituted in value for profits. It actually made it easier for me to argue. So does the question change your sentiments, all of you that are out there, if we said, can shareholder-owned corporations maximize value without harming the stakeholders? Or, and I'll put this in the chat in a second, Mike, or more broadly, how does the concept of value creation change the lens by which we're looking at this debate?
Right, I love that. Listening to Rob made me think a lot, and as did listening to Jill and listening to Sandra. Rob was optimistic that corporations are people all the way down, and I'm talking about sort of firms being oriented towards share price as this disembodied thing out there. Sandra added a layer of nuance, I think, to what I was saying, which is that it's neoliberalism per se that is a cause, that is sort of an ideology. So the concrete question is, most tech companies going public for the last 10 years have given their founders absolute control through extra voting rights, which should mean they can override the demands of share price. So does this mean that Mark Zuckerberg is thus a bad person? That he can't be driven by the system. It's not that there's a set of constraints that are forcing these companies. So why do they still act like share price is the most important thing in the world if they have the individual agency to behave themselves? Why don't tech firms, why don't they live out their promise of sort of making the world a better place if they have the mechanisms in place to avoid share price maximization? Or if Rob is right, maybe they're just bad people. So
yeah, so very quickly. So I thank you, Sandra, for bringing up the Bakan documentary, The Corporation, because it's always struck me that just because we can name some corporations that are psychopaths doesn't make all corporations psychopaths, right? Any more than we can identify psychopaths in our society and may even be elevating them to positions of power, alas. But that doesn't mean that we are all psychopaths. And I hesitate to make summary judgments about someone being a bad person, but Zuckerberg does a lot of things that bad people do. And so maybe, right? So we can come up with these examples, but that's more generally the point here is that when put in the hands of people who are more narrowly self-interested because they have been trained by us that that's what they should be doing normatively when we enter the business world, maybe we could just stop doing that and let people's, to the extent that they are innately good, let that surface at least, give it an opportunity to work within our organizations. But Mike asked for a relatively specific research question. To me, I'm intrigued by the idea of trade-offs. My colleague, mentor, co-author, and friend, Ed Freeman, says that there are no trade-offs, right? And that we should stop talking that way. And I think he overstates that case, but I do think it's an interesting tension between when do managers jump to trade-offs? How long did you think this through? How much moral imagination did you bring to bear on this question before you decided, well, it's shareholders or employees and we have to make a call, right? Because if we start to think about our values as being aligned, if we start to think about this over long term, then that should at least diminish the need for immediate trade-off thinking. So to me, I would be interested in trying to find some way to capture organizations that are better able to align values among their stakeholders versus moving too quickly to the trade-off mentality. And I will, the good people on the call to figure out how to operationalize those variables.
So let me pose a question that I think we're sort of skirting around, and see which of the panelists might want to take a chance at answering it. Part of what we're doing here is critiquing capitalism. So can capitalism be saved? Should it be saved? Is there an alternative to capitalism that is different from the current sort of neoliberal economics? Is there an economics that makes sense in this era? And what role do corporations with stakeholders play in that? Who would want to grapple with that? Jerry, I'm looking at you.
I will say one thing, that the one thing that the end of history kinds of arguments trouble me is that we do have to start with the materials we currently have, right? And so that I would, and I know Jerry is a very thoughtful individual, and so I'm sure he has considered this. But we can't cast off the entire system and reinvent from whole cloth. We have to sort of start with the institutions that are in place and decide where to go from there. So that would be my reaction.
Yeah. I mean, Paul Adler's on the call, and I feel like we should just defer to Paul and let him talk about his latest book, which is brilliant, and you should all buy it immediately. Paul posted in the link. But I would say there's a couple, the weird thing is, so Rob is living in Canada, and to the outside world, Canada and the US look like conjoined twins. I mean, basically identical, but in Canada, they drive on the left or something. But weirdly enough, Canada has much lower inequality, nationalized healthcare, inexpensive higher education. It doesn't take that many shifts in the DNA to get a fairly civilized looking society, which Rob has escaped to. And so those would be sort of modest tweaks at the national level. My concern is that shareholder capitalism per se, it has reached a point where it can't be redeemed. There's nothing we can do very readily within a system focused on share price. It doesn't, good people or bad people, we all focus on share price. If you have a pension, you care what the S&P 500 is doing. If you're a voter, you care what the S&P 500 is doing. It becomes this focal device that as a measure of how the economy is doing that we kind of can't escape. Firms can't escape it. Why does Zuckerberg continue to care about share price? Because that's how he recruits employees to work at Facebook. He can't escape share price. And yet, if I believe my own propaganda here, that way lies madness. As long as we continue orienting our system towards share price as the right measure of value, we're pretty much screwed. I guess the one pathway out might be that the three large passive index funds own about 23% of the S&P 500. So if we could get BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street to all agree to be civilized and to create a set of rules for public corporations that were humane and democratic, that might provide us a pathway forward. So there are actually three entities in shareholder capitalism that they got together for a beer and decided, how about more democracy and less climate change? That might be a path from our current system to something a little bit more humane.
Larry Fink of BlackRock has argued for all of their investments building in environmental, social, and governance considerations. I don't know. Jill, is that enough?
I don't know. I don't know if that's enough. I had a really hard time arguing my position. I'm sorry. I don't know. I don't know if it's enough.
Hey, you're not arguing it anymore. You can take whatever position you want. So I'm gonna pick up a couple questions from the chat. Odette, and I'm not sure who that is, said shareholders' goal is to maximize firm value, not necessarily each year's profits or each quarter's profits for that matter. However, if taking care of stakeholders maximizes firm value, then isn't maximizing firm value an appropriate goal?
So I'm going to jump in on that one, because I think the assumption there is that that there's some sort of a long-term orientation by the stakeholder that they're going to hang on to their shares for, but that short-term orientation is built into our system. So now I'm jumping over to the Jerry side, and so I don't argue against shareholder profit maximization. I really believe that companies should make money, right? But the bottom line is that I think the issue is the short-term orientation that creates the problems, for sure. So.
Sandra, it's important to, one of the implications of my first slide is that there is a distinction between shareholder wealth and profits, right? So we can, and again, this is controversial, but we can maximize profits, but that doesn't say who should get how much of them once they have been maximized. Again, and we can talk about whether maximization of profit is a better objective function or not, but once they're maximized, we can give them to whomever, according to the business judgment rule, according to essentially all corporate law. Leaders can do whatever they want with those profits once they are maximized. Now we have this dogma that suggests that we have to give it all to shareholders, but that's just not what the law says. And so I would make that distinction in case it helps.
Let me challenge you on that, Rob. So the original meaning of wealth has to do with well-being, not just money. So is wealth maximization or profit maximization the only goal that matters?
Of course not. That's why and again, I actually am probably coming around to Jerry's way of thinking here. We have given the discretion. No, I was always there. We've given discretion to a great number of leaders over the last 40 or 50 years, and they don't seem to have used it in ways that have benefited society as much as we, society, wish they had. And so it may be time to crack the whip a little bit and draw in some of that discretion. I think that's regrettable, honestly, because I think that there's room for a lot of different ways to run corporations. Some of them can, in fact, emphasize other forms of wealth. And I think that we're starting to see some corporations actively and genuinely struggle with this. What does it look like to turn off the servers on the weekends just to force you to take a weekend? What does it look like beyond, yoga as a wellness program, right? What else might we do? And so I think that once again, the palette is available for an innovative leader who wants to gather like-minded folks around herself.
What can companies do in a system that is consistently and basically only demanding profitability or wealth maximization, however you define it? Jerry, you look like you have something to say.
I did want to just throw out a thought that the idea of short-termism popped up in this discussion at various points, and seeing that as a pathology. And I want to challenge that. I don't think that shareholder value leads inevitably or even usually to short-termism. Counter evidence would be the entire biotech sector. They go public, making clear that they're not going to make profits for at least 10 years and maybe not even then. And Amazon, I mean, for heaven's sakes, for the first 18 of its 20 years, Amazon made no profits because its mission is total global domination. That's a very long-term project. So nobody's saying Amazon focuses too much on the short term. No, they focus on global domination, which takes a while. And so short-termism may not be the problem. So I wouldn't want to lay that at the feet. If anything, share price is the best way to capture, by definition, it's a net present value from eternity to now. So it's potentially a very long-term oriented measure. So I don't think that's necessarily the problem. I'd also say that if we're all basically, if the species is going to collapse if we don't handle climate change in the next 10 years, then I'm less worried about building durable institutions that will last 1,000 years. I want institutions that are going to fix our current problems now. If we don't make it through the next 10 years, then we're all screwed. And so long-term thinking feels like a luxury in a world where the sky is orange and you can't breathe. So I want some sort of short-term solution thinking.
I hadn't seen this come up in the chat, but how does the pandemic and the transformations that have already begun to happen in many places and many companies play into the current way we think about what the role of our corporations is with respect to their stakeholders?
I've heard it said that adversity builds character. I believe adversity exposes character. And I do think that this is going to be an opportunity to see, because to your earlier point, Sandra, leaders can, there's a wide open palette here. Yes, resist the pressures to do the short-term wrong thing, right? We all do this in academia, right? We could publish a lot of papers, right? But we resist that temptation so that we can publish hopefully good papers. And so, the process is there, and we have some number of opportunistic instrumentalists, and we have some number of people of integrity. But I do believe that the system does reward the lesser integrity people. But we can also stop doing that. And I don't know if that means institutional regulation or just choosing from whom you make purchases and with whom you do business.
Carolyn Flammer, you had a question earlier. You want to ask it? You want to unmute yourself and ask a question? It was about multiple stakeholders. Multiple types of investors.
Sure. Thank you, Sandra. And thanks for the panel. It was not so much a question than a comment, but I think maybe following up on what you said, Sandra, I think we need to reframe the question, and we need to realize that there are different shades of shareholders, correct? Not all shareholders are short-termistic. So in management, typically when we think of shareholders, we think of a very short-termistic kind of hedge fund type of shareholder, but there are very long-term shareholders in there where I would argue that it's potentially managers are more short-termistic than shareholders. So we may need a more differentiated view in our management literature about who these shareholders are, what type of shareholders, and how that actually influences the decision-making of companies. So in my view, it's not necessarily a shareholder versus stakeholder debate. It's rather, we may want to think about firm level versus system level and short-term orientation versus long-term orientation.
So I see Mike posting if people want to suggest specific research questions. So Carolyn, do you have a research question that comes out of that?
Oh, well, the research agenda. Maybe, I think it would be worthwhile to try to bridge the silos of finance and management, and there's tons of potential opportunity for research.
It's surprisingly hard to do, to get very specific with research questions, which is what I'm going to try to continue throughout the series to shove us to do, because we are awesome at just talking and talking past each other and having our own views, but to get those to a very narrow point where we can then test them and see who's right, who's wrong, or at least get even better questions that point out more contingencies that we need to consider is kind of my overall aim here. I just wanted to throw that out there, and to the degree that we can get more specific. And I am going to bug each of the presenters today after the fact to try and give me a couple, three very specific research questions, because you didn't do it before and you know you didn't. So we'll try.
Sorry. Can I make an obnoxious observation, Mike? Which is that if we focus focus too quickly on what are the researchable questions, given what journals love, what we're going to end up doing is studying things where we have long time series data where we can run fancy fixed effects models on the way the world was in the past. And I think what the world needs from management researchers today is designs for institutions that are going to solve the problems we have now. So we've got a set of raw materials to create really different kinds of organizations. If the incentives are, let's analyze the past where we have a lot of data rather than create new kinds of institutions, I think that might not help us address the problems that we have today. That feels a bit different. It's a bit different from come up with a research problem, ideally that you can address using the Wharton Research Data Services by running a nice fixed effects model with some crazy natural experiment thrown in. That's what we do naturally. But if the goal is not to write more papers, but to solve problems, we might address this, this issue a bit differently.
Oh, no, that's an excellent point. And the intent here isn't to say that you can only do it through ordinary least squares regression or something like that. There are lots of other ways. You know, I'm not saying that there is any particular method. And in fact, you know, the 2020 paper that Irene Henriquez and Brian Husted and I have out is specifically about using experimental methods, design methods, you know, to do that kind of thing. So,
okay, I'll throw this in for you, Mike, since you pushed. Yeah, pick your favorite bias and see what it would do if we took that seriously. This is kind of what Bossy and I did around reciprocity and fairness. I think that things like in-group bias, I think that whether or not people actually are risk averse might matter. So yeah, and it's there's Bundy. So that would be one thing, because we have to do it sort of little bit at a time, I would say. We can't say an art, right? But here's a little more complexity. What does that do to our currently influential, as I heard Jerry one time say many years ago, theories developed during the Ford administration? Can we sort of update some of those until we get to a point where we have fresh ones?
Yeah, great. I'm interested in exploring the boundaries of what the hell I'm trying to do as well. And make this completely meta. But if people have ideas on how to do this structure better too, please post those.
Yeah.
Can I just throw something out there, because I put something in the chat about the role of institutional investors here. You know, institutional investors have all the power, right? Because they own all the shares. And in a very Pollyanna-ish way, I'm still going to throw out there that I do see hope when I see that, for example, the Council of Institutional Investors shifted in the last 10 years from calling out businesses for their financial underperformance to calling out businesses on their underperforming on the social performance side of things. And you can see that actually, it's interesting, about 15 years ago, they began posting, the CII posted letters basically shaming businesses who were underperforming financially and asking CEOs to then write back in response to the shaming. And they then shifted around 2010 to the shaming on social issues. And then it seems to have fallen off or fallen by the wayside. But for a period of time, I had hope that these large scale investors were going to try to reframe their focus on more of a, I'm going to put the long-termism out there again, Jerry, the long-term orientation, because they are the institutional investors that, you know, arguably have that focus, as well as using their power that they have maybe for potential better business behaviors.
So I know Jerry has written about the sort of dominance today of the finance world. And it didn't always used to be that way. The original purpose of finance was to support and fund businesses, but it didn't have the power that it has gained over the last, I don't know, 40 years or so. Should there be some sort of rebalancing of the power of the financial institutions? So, Joe, you're just mentioning institutional investors and all the power they have. And Jerry mentioned the three big investors who, if they changed their ways, would rock the world. Is it systemically what we want to have finance playing such an important role, given its orientation? Ooh. Everybody's muted. Jerry, you're muted.
Yeah, I know. This sounds too much like me, so I wanted to back off and let Jill or Rob or someone more moderate and thoughtful than me weigh in on this one.
Maybe we don't need moderation and thoughtfulness. Maybe we need a little risk taking here.
Yeah, I mean, as I think that share price has become such a boundary object that so orients what corporations do, what investors do, what retirees. Most of the population is invested in the stock market in the US, not in large amounts for the most part, but enough that they pay attention. My sister was widowed pretty early. She got a settlement from the company, threw it into a Fidelity account, and every day for the last 25 years, she logs in every morning, makes a cup of coffee, logs into her account, and sees whether her account has gone up or down. And if it's gone up, she goes to Red Lobster for lunch. And if it's gone down, then she has a tuna sandwich and cuts coupons out for the day. So it's the stock market particularly has so pervaded our culture. There's even this orange fellow who seems to think that stock market performance is the best indicator of economic performance, ignoring the lived experience on the ground. So it's like we've sort of set this thing as this cultural North Star that's really hard to escape. So I don't know what it would look like to put that back in, put that genie back in the bottle.
Yeah, Rudolph Durand, you had an interesting question that you thought might be researchable. You want to bring that up, Rudolph? Unmute yourself. There you are. You're not coming through.
Rudy, you sound like you're in witness protection. I don't know.
Yeah.
Is it better?
Yeah, that's much better.
That's better, yes.
Is it better?
Yes.
Better.
Okay, sorry about that. It's my headset that doesn't work sometimes. Yeah, so I mean, there is, to me, a very puzzling question, which is that actually decision makers would like just actually to pursue a dual objective, which is a financial and non-financial objective at the same time. It's not obvious, it's difficult, but what is more troubling is that actually they don't know what would be the consequences for actually their share price. So we have some research, and many of you actually have actually worked on this, that show that, of course, perhaps CSP will lead to CFP, to financial performance, but this is not enough, I think, to determine the behavior of these general managers and CEOs, etc. So the question is, if decision makers do decide to maximize, operationally speaking, financial performance and maybe non-financial outcomes, how does it fare in terms of share price and value for their firm?
Thank you. I think that gets at some of the kinds of questions that Mike is trying to point us to. Irene Henriquez, you've been having a lively conversation. You want to raise one of your questions? Irene? I see you.
Hi. There's been a huge disconnect between the market and COVID, right? You would think that during the COVID crisis that markets should be going down. They're not. And one of my hypotheses.
Oh, you muted yourself. You got muted there.
Yeah, sorry. And one of my hypotheses is that all the gaming people who are betting They've all gone into the stock market. They realize, oh man, this is great stuff. And so we're seeing this because we now have, there are now sites where there actually is, you don't have to pay any fees at all to do this. There's no fees to companies. So all you care about is volume, and you always get a penny for each of the transactions. So what I'm trying to say is we need more research to find out what's going on behind the scene, right? Are these markets being taken and used for other purposes? And this disconnect is huge. And so we're seeing this. And this COVID has actually opened up all these things that are happening that our research says it shouldn't happen. And so now we're going into it and say, whoa, this is fascinating research. Are companies actually doing things? Are things getting better? Why are people, the marginalized people, being the lowest paid? I mean, all these questions are questioning our whole system. And I'm working right now with Indigenous communities. And so they're asking, hey, you know, you guys are, your market's really weird. Your whole economy is based on individuals. What about the community? Anyway, those are just some thoughts for future research. What are other approaches? Can we listen to other types of research to see how this can actually help in what we're doing? Thank you.
Thanks, Irene. Anyone on the panel want to respond to Irene?
Let's just stop measure. It's not a good measure. Stock price is a good measure of stock price, right? I mean, we can stop using that as our dependent variables tomorrow. It's always been a little suspect. And as Irene points to the divergence between Main Street and Wall Street, let's just stop. I mean, we don't have to watch. We don't have to look. We don't have to react. We have other, actually more foundational, fundamental, important things to look at.
Jill?
Then how will my sister know whether she should go to Red Lobster for lunch or have a tuna sandwich at her desk? I mean, without that, but that is, I mean, your ability to retire depends on the S&P 500. So conceptually, I'm happy to jettison it and say terrible measures, we should abandon this. My ability to live in comfort and
But your sister has to sell the stock in order to go to get the money, right? It's all on paper. That's what I'm trying to say. It's from 1 minute you see it go up 4%. By the end of the day is negative, right? I mean, they're playing within day stocks. It's really bad. And so Trump keeps saying, let's look at this. Don't. It's not what it's supposed to be. And so anyway, I'm just.
So I really don't agree with the concept that we should stop looking at share price, Rob. I mean, that is the only way we assess what the shareholder might be thinking. I mean, and in particular, as a governance researcher, an event study tells me a lot about their reaction to the actions of a board of directors in particular. And so no, we still need to look at those share prices because as has been noted, we keep talking about shareholders as this homogeneous group, but they're not. And so we have to try find whatever way we can the insight into the shareholder's mindset. And so I'm all about a good event study with a good share price bump in reaction to something. So hence, a la my director tenure paper, which showed that shareholders were really pissed off about these old fart men who have been serving on boards for over 50 years. So there you go.
Nancy D. Tommaso, do you want to raise some of the issues that you're raising and point us in the direction of some new questions?
Not necessarily, but there are a number of issues that came to mind for me in the conversation, particularly the issue that if we think only about individuals and individual moral responsibility, as several have suggested, we have a very different conversation than if we're talking about systemic issues such as Jerry was raising. And so I think we have to keep that in mind. And when we're talking about that distinction, that also applies to corporate leaders, because if corporate leaders are only focused on what they are doing with regard to their own companies and don't think of their responsibilities more generally, in terms of a political role within the society to support those kinds of things that would create more equity, not only from what their companies do, but from what companies do in general, then I think it's important for us to keep, to zero in on those kinds of responsibilities and not just what they do with regard to shareholders versus stockholders. And then I put several things about Federalist 10, which relates really to the issue about what is behind many of these conversations in terms of the kind of assumptions we're making about the sanctity of property ownership. So if we're talking about corporations, one of the issues has to do with who has contributed to the generation of whatever wealth or value or profit that that corporation has contributed to. As Elizabeth Warren had noted, you know, who paid for the roads and who paid for the schools and who paid for the firefighting and for the police and so on. The corporation itself did not do those things, maybe especially when they get tax breaks. So there is a collective contribution to the wealth creation and to the value creation, and therefore there should also be a collective benefit from that wealth creation to people that are not just the owners of that firm or the holders of that stock. And so the whole issue about how we treat property, I was directing us to Federalist 10, is about property owners versus non-property owners. So when they're talking about factions in Federalist 10, the concern that Madison had was that the majority of non-property owners could vote or otherwise take action to try to redistribute the wealth from the smaller number of wealthy property owners. We need to keep these kinds of things in mind. There's a lot going on, obviously, in these conversations, but I just wanted to add some of those dimensions.
Thanks, Nancy. Any responses from the panel? Rob?
Yeah, that would be very entertaining for Nancy and I to have a bit of an excursus on Federalist number 10 and its implications, but I will eschew for the time being. Perhaps we can do that offline. My general point about the role it was playing in my slide is that the Federalists, the people right, Publius was intimately concerned not with making people more perfectible, but taking people as they are and trying to figure out what kinds of systems would better rein in our more selfish instincts.
I mean, what's intriguing about Federalist number 10 is that Madison points out that it's not a property interest. There's farmers, there's merchants, there's bankers, there's manufacturers, there's many different flavors, each of which could lead to a faction. So the notion that property produced a class interest, which has popped up in subsequent social theorists. What's weird about the stock market is it flattens it down to one thing, the S&P 500. That becomes the property interest, the one summary measure that takes everything else into account. And so it flattens the diversity of interests that Madison talked about. I don't know where to go with that, but politically it ends up being fairly powerful as an indicator of economic well-being.
And I do worry that we've lost our sense of irony. So Jerry's story about his sister is preposterous, right? So that's what I mean by stop paying attention. To Jill's point. Yes, it matters. I want to be popular in the same way that I don't know how many of you know where you are on the Times higher education ranking of your institutions, right? And I don't know how hard you work every day to make sure that that is on the ascent. But my suspicion is that you do what you're supposed to do every day. And to the extent that you are successful with that, then the Times higher education rankings will reflect that. And so to me, that it is an outcome measure more so than an aspiration.
To me, it's about the system. We all do what we're expected to do, just as corporations do what they're expected to do. I think we have time for one more really quick question, and then we'll go to Mike's notion that each of the panelists will give us a couple of research questions. So, Michael Pearson, you've been raising a lot of questions, and I know you come from the humanistic management perspective. Can you give us one insight, just one?
Thank you, Sandra. The question of research questions, looking at biology and the insights of Darwin actually in reality could potentially spark a number of interest regarding the point Rob was making about human nature. I think there is a lot of work on ethical systems that builds on that actually integrates all of this quite nicely and can explain human survival. And I think if we're talking about organizational design, there's a lot of food for thought there, which can feed research questions and enable or explain or predict human survival and organizational design.
That's sort of a more macro kind of question, I think. Yeah, good. So I want to go back to Mike's notion that he's going to ask each of you to come up with a couple of one or two research questions that we could look at. I'm going to go in inverse order. So I'm going to start with you, Rob.
Sandra, I just have to interrupt because I've got to teach at 12:30. So I'm
oh, okay,
rocking and
Jill, do you
rolling
want to
right
go
now.
first? Yeah.
So, well, no, I already threw mine out there about I think we need to explore the concept of value creation and what it means for shareholder-owned corporations relative to other shareholder-owned corporations, as well as to nonprofit or B corporations. I think there are differences, and that, of course, is a big, mucky construct to explore. I see there's a lot of stuff in the chat about alternative measures of dependent variables. Yes, yes, yes. As an editor at BAS, you don't want to see any more papers about the relationship between corporate financial performance and corporate social performance. No more, no more. Done, 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 done. Let's look at the stuff that Barnett et al. Have argued for. And there I get to flip back into Jill Brown instead of the devil arguing the first point there about maximizing profit. So
thank you,
hi,
Jill.
everybody.
Have a good class. So I couldn't agree with Jill's point more. 2,200 plus counting studies on the CSR financial performance link. We don't need any more of those. Rob, and then Jerry.
Yeah, I don't know if this is specific enough. I'm fascinated by the relationship between competition and cooperation in business organizations. We tell everyone that the sort of Porter model is based on that we are inherently in competition in a zero-sum game, more or less, with everyone we work with all the time. And certainly if I am the second violin, I would like to be first violin, but we are also primarily part of a symphony. And so to me, speaking of competition as the defining characteristic of economic life toward the nature of cooperation in those same systems.
And Jerry?
All right. We haven't talked about democracy very much during this, so I'm going to post something in the chat, which is a wonderful initiative called Democratizing Work that some of our colleagues who may be here in the room are involved in. Julie Batilana and several other scholars have put this together. I would love to see more work on democratic organizations, creating democratic organizations. What are their dynamics? How do we use the tools that we have now so that it is sort of the people doing the work that have control over the enterprise and its decisions? There's been some old school work on co-ops that is mostly old school, but I think that the tools that we have currently, information and communication technologies, everybody's got a smartphone, the ability to vote, to collaborate, to work as a democratic entity seems underexplored, but something that we really ought to be looking more into. And running some experiments. Let's create some and see how they work and learn and build on that. So democratizingwork.org. Go now, join, it's great stuff.
And I'd argue that we need to take that and push it up to the impact that corporations are having on our broader democracy. That would be one area of really important study. Mike, I'm going to turn it back to you for the final word.
Well, first, just thank you all very much. Thanks to Jill and Jerry and Rob and Sandra. Just a quick round of virtual applause, if we can. For everybody. I guess I'm the only one unmuted. I don't know how effective that is, but thank you all very much. I greatly appreciate it. And this was a great way to kick off our session. I will work with Deborah Flamengo to get all of this stuff online and as solid a format as we can make as we continue to push toward trying to be more and more concrete with the outcomes here. A reminder that next month, October 16th, we're going to extend some of these ideas, but we're going to ask the question, is capitalism the most effective way to advance society? And I think we'll have some very strong views there. We have Peter.
Oh, I know the answer to that one.
No cheating. No, not yet. All right, so Peter Klein, Paul Adler, Anita McGahan, and Maurizio Zolo will be that panel. So it should be, I hope you all can join us for that. And thank you all for taking the time to be with us today. And
thank you, Mike, for putting all of this together. What a heroic effort.
Here, here. Thanks, Mike.
It's fun. Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you all.
Thank you, everyone, for paying attention.
Bye-bye.